Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luer, and we're crossing the globe again today, all the way to Austin, Texas, to connect with my fellow sports entrepreneur here, Mark Pennis. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to a good hour here with you, and not just taking a really deep dive into your amazing career across the globe, really, but also, of course, touching on some, recent happenings around the world, which fit very well with your own career in football in Europe. And of course, the European Super League, which has, been on everyone's radar, or many people's radar at least, over the last, week or so. So we'll got plenty of stuff to cover. And I want to do just a bit of quick introduction for some of the folks who might not know you. You're originally from Boston, but studied in Texas, in Austin, Texas, which is where you are right now as well, at UT. As a fellow Texas graduate from TCU, we've always had a good rivalry there with UT during those days. So I have fond memories of that. You're also a fellow lecturer now at UT, which is cool. Maybe we'll touch on a bit later.
Yeah, I'm a teaching fellow.
Yeah. And so, but what I'd like to use as well, sort of just Austin as a city is such a great metaphor, I think, for your own career, because it obviously is well known for UT, especially for the, football team there. And but it also now around the world, what probably most people would probably recognize for Formula One, right? That's probably the biggest high profile event there in the world of sports happening every year. And now with Miami, of course, coming on stream, it might take a little bit of shine off there, but, Austin has done great job hosting the races there the last few years, and I think your career has a bit of that as well, right? You started in the US and then of course spent a large chunk of your time in Europe on different projects there. So we're going to do a little bit of crisscrossing around the globe here and have some fun with that. Your career really started in the US with the New York Knicks, and we're going to touch on that. You had then a stint with a basketball team in Europe. You spent a couple of years with HSBC, again, and the sports marketing role there. And then, of course, many folks would know you from AS Roma as the CEO for several years. And then you sort of came back to the US and started your own enterprise and a few other things. So we're going to dip into all those things. And as we always do, we go straight to the frontier. And that is coming out of UT and your first role there with the Knicks, which later on, became the chief marketing officer. But I'm assuming wasn't probably your first role coming out of college. So how did it all start with the Knicks and how you got from Texas into New York?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Marcus. It's great to be with you. I've loved listening to the podcast. You've had some amazing guests. So I hope I can contribute to the rich tradition you've put together so far.
I'm sure you will.
So I think take a step back from that and say, when I was in high school in the early and mid 1980s, I wanted to have a career in professional sports. And at the time, and even still today, University of Texas's sports program was the top sports program in the United States. So I actually came to UT, not as an athlete, but as someone who's going to work on the business side of the sport, of the business. And I ended up working with the basketball team while I was down here, and partly that into an opportunity to get an internship with the New York Knicks. So I did a summer with the Knicks working on the communications team, which was great. It was a great opportunity in one of the world's biggest media markets to understand or to start to see how the call and response and kind of the ecosystem that lives around a professional team in a major market. Went back to school for a year, finished up an honors program where I actually did a thesis on collective bargaining in sports, the crisis collective bargaining that happens in North American sports between players associations, the trade union, and the leagues. And then from there, went back to the Knicks and started doing marketing for the Knicks. I had an operations role. I was responsible for making sure that everything that was happening on game day would get executed. And Madison Square Garden is a very unique building. At the time, there were 19 different trade unions operating in that building. Wow. And so I was able to learn an awful lot about really working with just a large array of groups that had very defined roles. And in order to do anything new or innovative, you really had to have built up relationships and trust with those groups because they didn't have to do anything that wasn't prescriptively in their employment agreement as a unit, as a union. So so it's a great place to cut my teeth.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, look, now this is where, just to give people, the listeners, a sense, we're talking the 1990s here, right? You spent about 10 years almost with the Knicks, 1990 to about 2000. So now I have to admit, I should have checked it, but you tell me where was the team at that time? Was it Patrick Ewing time and the Knicks were flying high, or where was the team at, sort of from the playing level?
So when I was an intern, the team had come off a decade where they had drafted Patrick Ewing, one of the iconic players of all time, and they had very mixed success, not real success. There was an expectation that they should have been much better than they had been during the initial part of his career. I in the interim year that I went back to to University of Texas, the club hired Pat Riley, who had won a number of titles with the Los Angeles Lakers. And so when I came back, it was Mr. Riley's first year, and that led to a decade-long run of the second round of the playoffs, or better, every year, including 2 finals appearances, including a loss in a Game 7 in 1994.
That was in Chicago, right? Was it?
Chicago eliminated us 6 times in that decade, actually.
Oh, right. Yeah, I do remember. There was obviously a big rivalry with Michael Jordan there.
But it was Houston. So, it was Houston. We lost Game 7 in Houston.
All right. Okay, cool. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of the time, obviously, where I was studying at TCU. So I graduated there in 94. So I do probably remember watching some of that on TV while you were there working. That's awesome. Now tell us, before we sort of move a bit on, of course, into other parts of your career, at the end of the day, you were the chief marketing officer, VP of marketing there. And that means, I'm assuming, is go find me the money, right? What were you guys doing at that time? And, being, of course, in New York, Madison Square Garden, and the Knicks, being a big team, what is it, what you guys do different than, or if you're looking back now, what you were doing in the 90s compared to maybe what people do now?
Well, the structure, I think, it's important to understand the structure that was in place at the time. So Madison Square Garden was and is, in effect, but was certainly at the time, a vertically integrated company. So that means that it owned the facility, the arena, Madison Square Garden. It owned the clubs that played there, the New York Knicks and the New York Rangers of the NHL, and then ultimately the New York Liberty of the WNBA. It also owned its own broadcast network, MSG Network, and MSG Network was far and away the engine from a revenue standpoint. And indeed, Marcus, as you know so well, and your audience will know so well, media is the, unparalleled engine that drives revenue in professional sports. It just is. And so our sales for the clubs were centralized. The sales force was centralized through Madison Square Garden Network. And that meant that it was media led first, which it should have been. Absolutely. But packages were always sold comprehensively across, entertainment properties, the venue itself, and the sports teams. And so if you're sitting there in the most valuable sports property, as the Knicks were at the time, the issue that you had was we felt we never got full value because we were being used as a leverage point. If you want to buy Knicks, well, then you need to buy tennis that was coming in, or boxing, or, we need a partnership for our concert series. You need to be buying television time on whatever that was running.
Okay. So guys were the bait.
We were certainly the bait. And from a physical property standpoint, now at that point, MSG Network also had the Yankees. So the Yankees had 162 games and were pretty dominant in the 90s. I want to say one, maybe may have been as many as 4 World Series in that period. So they're driving cash at the network level as number one. MSG didn't own the Yankees. So for the in-house properties, we were the marquee property. And oftentimes we just felt that, we were being bundled in. So as I transitioned from commercial operations into more of a commercial role, I proposed we create a partnerships group specifically for the team, for the New York Knicks. And we started selling everything that was non-media related that had effectively been undersold. And this is an era where, premium items were emerging as something that, wouldn't be a once a year or twice a year phenomenon, but something you were trying to do every game, perhaps even doing different ones for your premium seating. We had a number of opportunities in the building to enhance people's experience. And we took advantage of it. And we ended up, in the first year, we were generating almost an additional $4 million in revenue, which at the time, the top line revenue for the team was about 120 million. So,
I was just going to ask. So, okay,
it started to move the needle.
Piece of money, right?
Yeah, for a startup, basically. And when I say a startup, I mean, it was me. I had one salesperson, and we put together an operational staff, and off we went. And of course, what that did is it also brought in advertisers or partners who wanted media, and so it actually helped contribute to the larger sales engine that was MSG Network.
Interesting. So, so the CMO role, was it more of a, let's say, sales role, or was it really also doing marketing in a more traditional sense? What was sort of the remit here?
Yeah. So it's interesting because, for the biggest clubs, there is always this debate. Are you a sales-driven organization or are you a brand-driven organization? And the reality is you need to be a top club from a market standpoint, from a historic success standpoint, and just your place within whatever league you're playing in order to be a brand-driven club, right? And so the Knicks were one of those clubs, and that allowed us to be much more strategic in our sales process and making sure that everything tied in directly to the longer-term brand architecture that we had built over the 90s for the club. If you're a small market club and you don't have a great history of success, the bottom line is you have to be sales driven. You have to take every dollar that walks in the door, or that you go and knock, on every door you knock on, because you just need to generate that revenue. But as if you're a bigger club and have more stature, you have the ability to have sales work for you to continually reinforce the value of your brand. And so we were brand driven. So it was very much a brand and classic marketing role. It was also a time when new media was emerging. And so there was a whole digital aspect to this that was starting. And then the third thing was, I'd say the third leg of the stool was just CRM, like customer relationship management was something people talked about a lot, but really hadn't started to implement it in a proper way. In the same way, I think that people are talking about the usage of the next iteration of that generationally, which is, everyone talks about data today, but not many people are actually able to execute on the possibilities that data provides.
Yeah, interesting. Now, as I said, before we move on, maybe one quick deal, but one big deal sort of which comes to your mind, which you guys brokered with the team, which, sort of you're proud of.
Well, we had any number of pretty large groundbreaking deals. I think one of them that I thought was dynamite is we did a deal that brought American Express in for the first time to do a co-branded card. It was a multi-year deal. It was multi-millions every year. And again, you're going back a significant amount of time, and these categories, and then these numbers today don't seem large, but at the time they were certainly league leading.
So it's an affinity card program, basically. What we're talking about.
It was an affinity card program for sure. But what it did is it allowed us, at the time, Amex was certainly positioned as a much more rarefied card offering than MasterCard or Visa or Diners Club, which I think still had some legs in that era. And so to bring them in, to get them to partner with us and the Rangers to do co-branded cards was significant. It also overlaid so well with the card membership in New York City. And it allowed us to drive any number of other business opportunities off the back of that with marquee brands like Mercedes, for example. We literally used the Amex deal as a platform to then do a very significant Mercedes deal as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of them. We've done a couple here in Asia too, with big sports IP, and then local banks in Asia, and I do think that they work, right, because you can you have direct revenue. It's very easy to track the revenue against it, so everyone can see what's working, what's not working, and and certain brands like Ferrari and others have done a really good job promoting that over the years, for sure. Good stuff. Let's move on a little bit here, and I want to sort of just spend sort of a couple of minutes on your first, what I would sort of look like, at least. What was it? You spent 3-4 years there as CEO and founder. What were you guys doing?
So while I was at the Knicks, I went to law school nights in the mid 90s at Fordham, which was in Midtown, and had an itch to do a broader range of things than just the marketing and revenue generating side. Very grateful that I started doing the communication side, even more grateful that I had the revenue generating piece of this, but I felt it was a broader remit. I left with the chief marketing officer for Radio City and MSG itself, a woman named Pam Harris, who's a super talented, one of the all-time great brand marketeers, certainly in pro sports. And we opened a shop, and it was about helping brands drive revenue, and also do some significant consulting on how to operationalize systems so they could drive revenue better. And we worked with companies that were some media companies. We worked with Time Inc. We worked with Life, worked with InStyle magazine to help optimize them. We also worked with the Texas Rangers. We worked with the Dallas Stars. We did horse racing. We also worked with USTA tennis, and it was interesting because if you take someone like the USTA, the US Open was supposedly sold out, right? But the reality was they had about 40,000 tickets that were unsold over the course of the fortnight, that 2-week period, and they had a $30 per cap, right? So just getting people into the event meant there was a significant revenue opportunity for them, but they also didn't want to be positioned as having available tickets. So it was really about how to unlock a market for those tickets without really showcasing that there were thousands of tickets.
Yeah. You create that scarcity, obviously, object. And I've been to the Open several times, and you're right. It always has that appearance that it's impossible to get a ticket for it, but I guess there's always some left, right? Interesting. It's an interesting one. So, coming out of what you were doing, obviously, there in your new business, you then moved, you started working with the Paris Basketball Holdings, which is a U.S. holding group for a team in Europe. How did that happen? Talk us through that.
Well, the company we founded, Skilo Brand, was again a product that came into existence in 2000, and it gave us just that was right when the tech crash. Within a year, the tech boom crashed, the bubble popped. And so it gave us an opportunity to do a lot of different types of projects. And one of which, about 4 years in, was we were approached by an NBA player who wanted to join his new NBA star, who was a European, to go back and buy the club that he had matured, his academy club. It was in Paris. So we said, okay, Marquee City, fantastic. Let's see if we can help you acquire this asset. And this, again, gave me an opportunity to do things beyond, I think, the straight vertical of the marketing side of it and the revenue side. And I think, Marcus, that's one thing I've always tried to do in my career, is that I've worn a number of different hats, whether it's an attorney or a banker or general management or marketeer or partnership sales or commercial ops, but they've all had sports as the through line through them. And so this was a great opportunity to go into a different part of the business. I built the business plan, was structured the deal, did the final negotiations in Paris, as a matter of fact, closed on the deal. And then they asked me to go join them. And as the COO of the newly formed holding company, and then as the MD on the ground. The NBA player was Tony Parker. He was just finishing, I believe, his second year in the NBA.
So he was playing for
San Antonio Spurs.
Right, got it.
And
cool.
he had just won a title, so he's very popular, and so I went and did that for 2.5 years.
Yeah, awesome. So looking at your a couple of years there in Paris, your next up then was London. So how do you get from, again, being in the world of basketball, now all of a sudden you with HSBC, global director of sports of the sports group, and you spent about 5 years there. So, moving again very much from the I guess brand side into the client side, or the customer side here, working with one of the big banks in the world, which spends a lot of money in sports, of course. So I'm sure that must have been an interesting role. Talk a bit about that.
Sure. So when I was in Paris, the club was chronically undercapitalized, and it was not. I want to be very clear. It was not Tony Parker's fault. Other members of the ownership group, basically, it's a very common story, as we know in sports, claimed they were going to put in a significant amount of capital to drive, to complete the turnaround and get the club going. We had made really significant strides in Paris. We had increased ticket sales about 300%. We were back in the L&B playoffs. We were playing in Europe. So the club had been turned around at the initial level. In a turnaround is really like a cleanup stage. Then there's like a building block stage, and then there's a growth stage, right? And so we had done the cleanup, but again, we're undercapitalized. And so I spent a ton of my time, frankly, dealing with finance issues that at that point, again, I was an attorney and I had all the commercial sides of the business, but I really didn't have a finance piece of a set of tools that I could deploy. So I approached HSBC Private Bank and pitched them on setting up a sports practice that would bank athletes and institutions globally in sports. And so this was not, I was not on the commercial side on this in terms of marketing or sales. I was literally running a banking group. And initially, the focus was the UK. It quickly spread out, and within 5 years, we had about 500 athletes across the global footprint of HSBC, massive global clearing bank, and we were operating on 4 different continents.
Cool. Now let's dig a bit deeper here. Explain a bit about what it actually means. What were you exactly doing with athletes or with IP owners, and how were you banking them? Sure.
So HSBC Private Bank at that time in the mid 2000s was a bit of an anomaly. It was really, as most private banks are focused on asset management, it was really a wealth creation shop of a different nature. It was focused on credit, and it was really about helping people who have assets borrow against them. And so it was all bespoke lending. It was a great place to learn. What a group of super sophisticated bankers there were. Then it was just starting up the asset management piece in London because, as you know, HSBC with its global footprint had asset management in Asia. It had it in Switzerland, Monaco, Luxembourg. And so there hadn't been, the thought previous to that had been, well, we'll just have our clients do their asset management in a different location. As banking laws were tightened up after the financial crisis of originally of 2000, 2001, the tech bubble bursting. And there was a move to greater transparency as well. It became important to have the asset management piece on the ground in the UK. And so that part was being built up. And what we really did is we focused from an institutional standpoint on asset management. So we had some governing bodies, we had events that were quite significant in stature, where they would throw off cash. They were profitable, throw off cash on an annual basis, and we would help put together portfolios to manage that. On the athlete side, it was really about, frankly, athletes doing lending against what we call COI, right? Contractually obligated income.
Got it. Okay. And were you doing wealth management for them as well, or that wasn't really the remit?
we would do wealth management for them. I mean, the reality is, for the bulk of athletes at a time, I mean, football salaries in the main had not spike to the levels they were now by any means. And so a lot of athletes, you acquire them as clients early in their career because they've got a significant amount of COI, but they're living basically off cash flow. And early in their career, they don't really make money in their first contract as a professional. You're halfway through your second contract when you really start to cash flow, where you can put some of that in the bank and invest it. Because prior to that, the first contract, you're like, you're buying a house for yourself, maybe a house for your parents, you're buying some cars. Second contract, you're going to upgrade on the property. You might switch countries, you might switch clubs. So there's a significant amount of spending. And only then, if the second deal is a 3-year deal, only as you round into the second half of the second year, do you really start to accumulate some assets. And so we absolutely did wealth management, particularly F1 drivers. We had multiple F1 drivers in F1 champions in our group. We had people with a longer tail, tennis and golf. We're doing a lot more asset management. A lot of the footballers and rugby men, it was lending.
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned you had 500 athletes. So that's pretty much across the globe then, or was that still a bit more Europe focused?
No, that was across the globe. I mean, HSBC had a tremendous amount of sports business across, at the time it had probably 350,000 employees. And so it really was it had a global footprint, and it had a number of athletes as clients within there, or sports organizations as clients within there, but it didn't have anyone coordinating that and pulling that together, sharing best practices, rolling out new insurance products that could be used in multiple jurisdictions. And so that's what the group I founded, the Global Sports Group, that's what we did.
Right. Oh, cool. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I thought you were on the marketing front, but that's a very different part of the business, and but a very interesting part. I like that. Because as you said, HSBC was a big sponsor in golf, so I'm assuming there's some nice overlap between golfers, the guys who are playing there, and then the services you guys would be promoting. I'm sure that you have spent a bit of time in the VIP lounges there, hanging out there.
If that's where the agents are and the athletes are, then that's what we're going to be for sure.
Exactly. It sounds like a fun role there. And I like you said, it's another level of learning, I guess, right? Working then within this sort of financial setup there and the structures there. And and again, even today, if you think of it, the whole new lending going on there in sports now, particularly right with the current crisis, the banks are really deep in it. So I'm sure you have an interesting appreciation. Now, what I was going to ask as well before we move on here is obviously you were there during that global, the big global financial crisis, 2008 and 9. You were in the bank. I mean, what was happening? What did you see, from your perspective of being at a bank in this role you were in there? What was happening?
It was funny. In the middle of that, I remember speaking with my mother and on the phone. And at the time, bankers were being vilified, many rightly so.
Yep. And
earlier on, when I was just leaving school, I had an opportunity to go into work with a boxing promoter, and I ended up going to work with the Knicks. And I said to my mom, who would have thought between boxing and banking that boxing would be considered the more honorable profession these days? But it was a fraught time for sure. In 2008, in October of 2008, two things happened pretty much in the same fortnight, which I found amazing and something I've never forgotten. One was HSBC was one of a handful of banks that stopped interbank lending. So for those of you who aren't bankers, LIBOR is the London interbank overnight rate. And so what happens is banks lend to each other to make sure that they all have enough liquidity. You're waiting for a payment to come in 2 days, but you've just loaned a whole bunch of money out today. You may need some coverage. So that's how banks do interbank lending, keep stability in the system. As institutions started to fail, HSBC was one of a handful of banks that we can't do interbank lending. We don't know we'll get the money back. So that led to the contagion that froze the financial markets. And literally within days of that, Richard Scudamore landed 4% increases for the Premier League for the next round of media rights. So not flat, up a little bit, certainly not down. And certainly he could have postponed. He had a year. He could have postponed, but he didn't. And it just showed the enduring value to me of sports media rights, that in an audience erosion environment, and we've been in that for 30 years in broadcast media, that sports really had an enduring value. And so 08 and 09 were difficult. HSBC did not take any public support, so like no bank bailouts, because they had managed their balance sheet very, very well, super conservative. But the issue you have when you're conservative and then things go wrong and you're proving correct is you become more conservative, right? You don't become, at that point, you don't say, woo, here's all this opportunity, let's start lending money. So it actually was a difficult period for our practice, along with anyone else on the lending side, because the bank didn't have appetite for doing a lot of lending in that period. And so we had to be very creative in the way we structured deals, and we had to make sure that that they were very sound from the amount of security we were taking from our clients. And so that led to more complexity. So deals became more complex, they were slower, but again, as a learning environment, it was really, really difficult to beat.
Yeah, I can imagine. No, well, I mean, it was a crazy time, and being in a bank, I'm sure, you have even a different perspective than what we all had, watching it from the outside. So, yeah, it was some crazy years. Now, moving on along here nicely, so we're now around 2011 here. The banking crisis is nicely over. The world is a little more back to normal. And you end up joining the Raptors Accelerator Group here as the managing director back to the US in the Austin office. And I guess Raptor is part of the James Pallotta Group, right? The American billionaire.
It's his family office, yep.
Right. So talk us through that a bit, because that obviously then leads into, what we're going to be talking after, and that is football in Europe, sure. With AS Roma. But I guess you were first in Austin here.
So, we had, I met my lovely bride at U Texas, and we had then lived together in New York. So we left Austin in 91, had lived in New York, then had gone overseas for basically a decade. So we have children. I have three lovely kids, and we're looking to get back to the States for a stretch, not necessarily permanently, but just to have them live in the States for a bit. And so I was approached about joining another longtime sports industry professional, Sean Barr, and forming a JV with Jim Pallotta and opening Raptor Accelerator. And Raptor Group wanted to have a presence in Austin, so we said perfect. So we came back to Austin, and I set up the Raptor Group office down here, and almost immediately, Jim Pallotta invested in Roma as a limited passive investor, and so I was the person in the group that had international sports experience. And I started working on that project early on. Right. It had an initial, AS Roma had an initial general partner who was not properly capitalized, to be candid. And so what ended up happening is Jim took over really in a 4-month period out of necessity. Jim took over as first he went from a limited passive investor to limited active investor to the general partner. And so right. We had the bank UniCredit had stayed in as a shareholder. They had taken it over from the Sensi family rather than allow the club to be put into administration, which would have led to significant point penalties and probably relegation, and wiped out a significant amount of value in that asset. And so they were a partner of ours, and Raptor and the bank jointly appointed me as CEO to run the club.
All right, awesome. Well, let's and I want to spend a little more time now here on AS Roma. It fits so perfectly, of course, with what happened this week here with the European Super League, and we'll touch on that, of course, and your thoughts as, again, an American sports executive who understands the American closed system versus the European system. Being then eventually being the CEO of AS Roma. But before we get there, let's just unpuzzle a little bit what's going on here here was James Pallotta's investment there. So again, these are just some numbers I saw, and you can correct me where I'm completely off, or wherever you can comment on. So what I read is sort of, he bought 67 or 70% of equity in it, maybe at about 70, 80 million euro, depends on which report I'm looking at. But in total, within a few years, then the total investments was about 160 million, including cleaning up debt and other maybe older obligations there. So again, fairly significant investment even for a billionaire, and had a lot of big plans, right? You don't just take over a big four European club, and as Roma in Italy is a significant club, being in the obviously capital, versus the Inter and the AC Milan boys there, and Juventus there, which are the other big boys, of course. They aren't quite at that same level, hadn't really won that many, but from the stories I read, the plans were huge, right? Including a new stadium and really driving the value from, again, the numbers I saw. There was a valuation, I think, in 2016 of about 300 to 250 $50 million. But, the big picture was always about this could be a multi-billion-dollar club. So, talk us a bit through you coming in there at the beginning, I guess, in the office there in Austin, and then I'm assuming moving up to Rome to run the club as a CEO. Tell us a bit about those stories.
Well, so yeah, let me unpack that a little bit. So as far as the financials go, it's the club is publicly traded, so I won't comment on the financials. You can look through the accounts, right? They're there for everyone to see.
It was public already at that time too, or
yes, it was public. And Marcus, it was often humorous where, like, if you had to make a personnel change, like in the front office, like if you were swapping out the controller or a senior accountant or something, they'd say, "Oh, wait till the market's closed." I'd be like, "Come on, man." Like, like we're okay. I think like this isn't earth shattering, but yes, we were publicly traded. Okay. And so that was the first time I ran a publicly traded company. And it was, it's really, it is very different running a publicly traded company. I think there are some things there that are positives in terms of the amount of rigor it puts into an organization, because you simply, you're accountable in a much different way to a large group of shareholders. At the same time, it adds a lot of complexity and can be frustrating because your ability to operate strategically without sharing your plans with the marketplace is limited in a publicly traded company, because you have to, you have to lay out what you're doing all the time. The project. The project it had, there was a lot of ambition to it for sure. There was, over the course of the 5 years that I was there, I did 2 as the CEO and then 3 running the stadium project. We started working on stadium almost immediately back in 11, and the club. Listen, let's start with a basic principle. Every club is a selling club. Right. I think we have a belief that, the biggest clubs are buying clubs, and they certainly are, but everybody's selling. And so, a portion of your financial stability is dependent on your ability to develop clubs. To develop players.
The players. Yeah. You're talking about selling players. Right?
Yeah. And so, that was a part of our business model. We had some issues with Stadio Olimpico, great building, but very outdated for the modern era of what you'd want. Has a running track in it, so that complicates matters. Rome is a political environment for sure, and so the fan base was hugely passionate, amazing. Love the fans at Roma. They were very, very special, and so they had very high expectations as well. So complex environment for sure. And we started on the stage. So we were a good buying club from buying talent. We had Walter Sabatini as the director of football, did a great job during the period when I was CEO there. I wanted to focus on the stadium project. So, when we went in as an investment group, when Jim went in as an investment group, again, he went in as a limited passive investor. So if you fast forward then, 6 months and he's running the club, I hadn't seen my role as being the long-term role as CEO. So there was, again, a cleanup and a turnaround. There was a lot of work that needed to be done to modernize some of the practices at the club. And I think that happens anytime you have a club where you've had stable ownership for a couple decades. That unless it's a very cutting edge business, and a lot of them are these days, but go back a decade and many more weren't than are today, and it needed to be updated. So I did the updating piece, the cleanup, and then as we got into the turnaround piece, we hired in Idolo Zanzi as CEO, and I pivoted to run the stadium project.
But now, again, reading up a bit about it, Raptor Group obviously is involved in tons of businesses, including real estate and other things. And I'm assuming, again, as an American investor, he's looking at, Rome being this, big metropolitan city, and all the things you can do, especially with a new stadium, I guess in a certain part of the city. Again, very easy to see from the big picture point of view how that could work and how that would dramatically increase the value of the club, because the club didn't own the stadium, right? It was shared with another team in Rome, with Lazio. So right. Again, it's sort of a bit of this weird Italian mix, which you have in Milan as well. There, Inter and AC sharing it, and and Jeff Slack explained that already a bit before. Were you guys there at the same time? Was it sort of overlapping your period and his period, or?
No, I've fallen on years after Jeff had been there.
Right, yeah, I couldn't remember when he was there.
I consider Jeff a great friend, fellow Bostonian, and we've crisscrossed over time. We spent a bunch of time together in the UK. He is an elite operator, and look, all you have to do is watch what he's doing with that F1 team. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing in such a short period of time, the turnaround, the impact Absolutely. He's had. Really proud of him.
Yeah. But coming back to yours here, so again, let's talk about that stadium project, because again, just to preempt already, after all the work you guys put in there to get this up and running, it's been delayed. It was delayed several times, and I'm sure, and I'd love to hear a bit your thoughts on that. And until the latest I could see here, February this year, it was completely canceled, or they called it halted, was the words they used. Now that maybe means it's done and busted now, but so I'd love to, the great opportunity is so now to do this a bit retrospectively, right? When you were in there and you were setting it up, again, it made all the sense in the world, and now in hindsight, again, it obviously didn't. What do you think happened, and sort of unpack that a little bit for us?
So I think we tried to take an approach that was fairly unique in the environment that is Rome and Roman politics, Roman business. When we first started to put the project together, I was offered on several different occasions, we'll set up lunch with over a course of a month, we'll set up lunch with the biggest developers in the city, and you can decide which one you want to work with and look through the portfolio of available land they have and so forth. And we didn't want to take that approach because we felt it would be better to be, there was a big project, we better be transparent from the outset. So we actually put out a request for proposal with the specifications on what we needed for land. And that was really transparent. And I think the initial pushback was, there's not a lot of land available in Rome. Well, we had over 90 responses that actually fit the criteria. We had more that didn't fit the criteria, but we had 90, and then it allowed us to then go and engage with City Hall right away, and say, okay, we've gone through and we've culled it down to about a dozen. Take us through this dozen and let us know which you believe, from a political standpoint, an environmental standpoint, a commercial standpoint, a transportation standpoint, which ones you would consider viable and which ones that would be dead on arrival as proposals. And that got us down to about a half dozen. We were then able to, overlay some metrics on ancillary development around them, and that got us down to just a handful, 3 or 4. And then we were able to basically run an auction scenario against those 3 and 4, selected a piece of land, and then just started working on a comprehensive proposal, put together a dynamite team.
Sorry, Mark, to jump in for a second. Give me a sense of the timing here. This is taking months or weeks or years. What we're dealing with?
This is months.
Okay. So it's a reasonable speed to it. That's good.
Right. And so we had, and then, stadia development in North America is really quite sophisticated. This is about 2013, very sophisticated then, more sophisticated now, but we're able to reach out and say, let's grab, a world-class stadium architect. Let's go and get a great project management team put together. Let's make sure we tap, international security specialists. And so we were able to put together a really robust group, put together a dossier, and submitted it for municipal approval, and actually received municipal approval in 207 days. And
nice.
and what had,
so at that time that all looked good. And then so
it's great.
Now it obviously then it's sort of, I guess, you obviously left and you moved on, and we'll get to that later, what you were doing. But looking at, again, from the outside, and I'm assuming you always probably paid a bit of attention to what's happening to the venue. What's your reading on it? What is your reading on where it all went a bit pear-shaped?
I think a view on a market is very important, and Italy as a country, as a macro market, in Rome as a specific locality, you have to look at the specific characteristics of that market. And in Rome, certainly momentum is hugely important, and we had a lot of momentum early on in that project. I think that historically in Italy and in Rome, if projects start to lose momentum and start to stall, groupthink starts to take over and say, oh, well, this is going to be another one that didn't happen. And I did the project for the first 3 years. I got us through the design development stage, the initial set of approvals and so forth. I came back to the States on a full-time basis. So I had been commuting to Rome for 5 years on a back and forth. I'd spend the summers there, take my family over, but I was doing it very much on a commuting basis, and it was pretty punishing. And a lot of that was because when the project started in Rome, our view at Raptor Accelerator was we'll always have a short-term role, and the short-term role just kept rolling on. So I came back to the States. I don't know what happened from a momentum standpoint. I think, as you noted, they had some setbacks. And ultimately, I think when it was sold to the new ownership group, the Friedkin Group, they decided, after the amount of time that had gone on and some of the issues around further approvals or final approvals, I'm really not that sure that they would not pursue the project.
But yeah, and you mentioned that the club was recently sold, right? So I guess that happened before that. And I didn't read about it. Did you think he made his money back, or what was what's the report? Well, it's a public listed company, so what are the reported numbers out there? Do you know them by any chance? Or?
I don't, and honestly, it was a very complex financing structure. I wouldn't want to comment. I left in 2016. The club got sold in 2021, so or 20. Sure. A lot can happen.
It's been a while.
Yeah, a lot can happen between then. So I wouldn't want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Excellent. Well, interesting. Like I said, it's one of those typical stories. European football isn't that simple as we know. And so let's talk a bit about ESL, the European Super League here. On everyone's radar, the whole of the week lasted for, in real fact, I guess 48 hours, right? I mean, there was plenty of rumors before what was going on and what's going to come, but I think the real count is 48 hours, which isn't very long by any stretch of imagination. Here's would be my simple interpretation, without belaboring points which been communicated over and over already the whole week, and that is you have a group of very, very powerful teams and team owners. Many of them are American, and therefore I argue have a certain view of the world of how the OMS works, as closed leagues are the thing. And then you have, of course, others there who all see the opportunity to build something different and unique, and on a piece of paper with you on the club side, I can make all the logic, and I can argue, all the things that we're doing made sense to me. Then, of course, you have that Europeanism part to it, and being German, I can say that, where things aren't always as simple as it sounds like, and this whole collective, the idea of just having a small collective group of teams controlling everything versus, the opportunity of relegation and the small clubs having a chance to make it up and all the, fun stuff which comes with that. Clearly there was I would call it to some degree culture clash, even though you could argue it was maybe somewhat heavily driven out of Madrid there. But I think, so again, being an American, having worked across the world here, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what do you think happened there and the learning on the back of it.
It's been fascinating.
To say the least, yes.
And that's an easy way to lead in on this. Well, let's take a step back, right? So clearly, as an American, I've watched the vitriol focused on the American owners there, well, I would say it's well deserved. I'd also say that the group. Let's just go through the group that was that composed the Super League. If you take individuals or the entity like a sporting club like Barca or Real, and we go through and say, okay, if someone has 30%, what would the nationality break down? What did it break down for the ownership? We had 2 English at Spurs. We had the Italians. We had 3 Spanish. We had 2 Chinese. We had Russians. We had Emiratis. We had an Israeli. And we had 4 Americans. So it was a very international mix. I think the lightning rod certainly was the aspect of the closed part of the league, because there was supposed to be, I guess, 1/4 of the participants would rotate through. So we had a few things here. We had, I think, a group of owners from the most traditional, biggest European clubs saying to the entire group, the Italians, the Spanish, no, this is going to work. Don't worry about it. This is going to work. We can do a closed league. And I think you had follow on from the Americans, the Emiratis, the Russians, the Chinese saying, okay, well, if you guys say it'll work, let's give it a go.
We'll come along for the ride.
Yeah. And so right there, I just think structurally, I think you had a mismatch in people's ability to appreciate from the Far East all the way to the US and the West, all of the intricacies that you noted initially. So I think that's the first thing. I think we had a disconnect. The second thing is there was no infrastructure for the league, right? That there were, you had 12 teams, but it was shown with the way they tried to roll out the announcements. There were no guiding principles. There were there was no staff in place to handle, putting together the operational issues. Like, how was that?
There never seemed to have been a chief executive or someone like that who really was the leader of it, right? I mean, at least I didn't see it.
No, that did not exist. And so they had no media deals in place, and they had no one in place to do the media deals. Okay. So there was no, there was just missing so much infrastructure at the outset. Certainly the closed aspect of the league is fraught with, I don't know, let me call it hubris, right? Because promotion and relegation are, the connective tissue across all football leagues, really, in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and especially in Europe,
for sure. And so, so you have, so that's the platform that we're dealing with on the start, right? You had no infrastructure, you had no staffing, you had no media partner, you had no articulated plan for how you were going to have qualification, leaving the rest of Europe up for a single five individual slots to come in and play in a single year. So I think it was ill-fated at the outset, and then I think I would be important to turn to the rollout, because I think the rollout was fairly disastrous. From a process standpoint, I think that the 12 clubs in the Super League breakaway made a very significant strategic mistake in that they gave themselves a false deadline. So they were clearly concerned that UEFA was going to announce, an expanded and adjusted format for the Champions League. The expansion to 36 teams, plus more qualifying matches on the way in, a broader footprint, more matches, more revenue, and all ahead of a new media deal, set of media deals in 2024. And so there was this scramble all of a sudden to, preempt that with a Super League announcement. But I just come back to why. Why did they have to do that? In fact, what they could have done was made statements that say, we've always supported the Champions League. We're not sure about this expansion. We don't necessarily agree with it or believe in it. We think that there needs to be broader structural change, whatever. They could have said a million things, but gone along with it. And then let's fast forward a year. So you're in 2022. The media deals for 2024 have not, negotiations certainly haven't concluded by then, although they may have begun at the early stages. And you run a year of the new Champions League, and you've taken that year to build infrastructure, right? Identify staff, maybe even bring in some staff that are going to be working on, Project X, whatever. Have a proper lead media partner in place, or a handful of media partners that you're deep in conversations with. Make sure you have your narrative right. There was no. We'll talk about the narrative in a second, but
the part we said earlier already, that there was no one truly looking at was the true leader of the pack, right? Maybe it was a president. I mean, the one who seemed to at the end made the most, public statements. Obviously, was the president from Real Madrid there. But he was, at the end of it, he just 1 out of 12, right? He wasn't clearly the appointed leader of it. And so to me, that's interesting. Now, I can only guess one thing, is that no one in our industry was ready to take that job on, unless you would have thrown a lot of money at someone probably. Because I think if anyone I spoke to in our industry, honestly, didn't see it come, and didn't see how this would be successful. Everyone who knew a bit about it, from Phil Lyons, obviously, knows the Premier League as well as anyone, and others, and who I work with. We were literally counting down the days that it would fall apart, and it did, right? And I'm not saying we could foresee that, but it was just so obvious that there was so much wrong with it, and the complete lack of thinking there. And you wonder, because from what I hear is that BCG was one of their consultants, right, who probably put the whole thing together. You have JP Morgan there, as again publicly announcing that they would fund it or put some money behind it and backing it, and everyone I spoke to again goes, well, they wouldn't do this if there wasn't some revenue streams against it, right? They wouldn't just fund a blind league hoping that there was money there one day. And so all those things just didn't make any sense, right? It's just, I mean, again, coming back, you worked in a bank, what the heck was JP Morgan thinking?
Yeah, I can't speak to what JP Morgan was thinking, but I agree with I agree with the thought that certainly if you're going to put up, look, if you're going to, the own line of a bank is, own a bank, $10,000, it's your problem. Owe a bank $10 million, it's their problem. Owe a bank $100 million, it's everyone's problem, right? And so,
and it was 3.5 billion. So that was a much. so that's a collective problem.
Yeah, that's a collective problem. But also, it just signals that there had to be some type of asset base that they was going to take as security against it. And I understand it could have been against future revenues, but those future revenues were clearly going to be media revenues. And it certainly. There certainly seems to be pieces of information that we don't have at this point. I would also say that the lack of a narrative on the rollout, so, the midnight media announcement followed by a vacuum, nothing, no information laid out by the league, allowed, frankly, from a demographic standpoint, more senior pundits. So media of a fairly older age, over 50, to step in and just vent outrage. They were outraged. Everyone was outraged. And there was no counter to that at all. There was no focus.
They didn't seem to have even a PR agency in place to to deal with it. I mean, there's a bunch of rookie mistakes if you look at it, right? I mean, as clever as all the people are working in these clubs, right, and many of we know and are friends, but as I said, I'm trying to get someone on a podcast here to actually give us a bit of the insight for what happens from the other side here, because like I said, we're missing still plenty of info, but it was a complete PR disaster from top to bottom, right? I'm sure you saw the John Henry's public apology, right? His video, his clip there, and he's definitely eating some humble pie there. I would argue.
I think that the window on this particular version of a new competition has closed, and it seems that there are being regulatory steps to prevent a future competition from being formed. As far back as I remember in 2004, sitting in Hotel de Ville, so City Hall in Paris, speaking with the vice mayor for sports, a gentleman named Pascal Cherki, and he was saying, as far back as then, there was talk of a super league. He was saying, look, we still have to provide certificates of occupancy at the stadia. We have to make sure at a national level that the referees are being licensed. Like, we're just not going to do things that are going to destroy our domestic leagues. So, there was always going to be a headwind on something like this happening. That said, there are two things. One is there is a Champions League, so there is an international competition.
Correct.
Right. And so the ability for there to be an international competition always exists because there has been one. And then the second thing is the underlying issues here around the modernization of football. The Super League collapsed spectacularly, but those issues have not gone away. Right. You have massive clubs that have huge, highly sophisticated stadia. They have massive fan bases. They have international footprints. They are from a different planet than a club that makes it into the top division with a 20,000 seat stadia that's hasn't been upgraded in decades, and the entire size of the market that club sits in is 100 or 150,000 people, or sometimes even less. And so that type of disparity, that mismatch is still there, and it's only going to continue to grow. So we're going to be revisiting. I'm not saying the Super League again, but we're going to be revisiting these issues. We're going to have to revisit these issues for the health of the game. One thing I thought that was really interesting, a Morning Consult poll that came out a couple of days after the league had collapsed had said, basically, under 44, from an age standpoint, almost 60% were not opposed, and about a quarter were fully supportive. And that's with no narrative. That's with no ability to focus on fans in terms of the rollout. I mean, imagine if you had just said, we're going to be making so much in media money. Why don't we take a portion of the revenue and offset it against subsidized significantly lower ticket prices and sell 5,000 seats a match, mandate 5,000 seats a match going to families. All of a sudden, you would have immediately changed the narrative on this. People would have said, wait, I can bring my young children to see the biggest clubs, and ticket prices are capped.
It's pretty clear there was no PR or marketing strategy. That's pretty obvious, right? Yep. There was a big picture idea, and I'm sure that was, again, reasonably well thought through to some degree, right? You hire consultants and others to do this. I think there wasn't a real reality check to it as well. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, and this is the way I looked at it is, and as you rightly said, this has been going around. Anyone who watches or follows European football in the last 20 years, every 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you have the same thing pop up in some form or fashion, right? It's not the first time, and it comes out of different quarters. In occasion, the Italians tried this before as well. I was trying to remember the name of the gentleman who did it at that time. Again, the reason why it happens is really simple. UEFA is a monopoly in a sense, right? You're part of that larger ecosystem, but you have very little bargaining power, right? So I look at what Ferrari does every few years when the Concord agreement comes up, right? They go, I'm not going to play. I'm not going to, I'll pull out. And they get a better deal because you won Ferrari in F1. Same thing here, right? These big clubs have very little leverage with UEFA in a sense until they start, coming up with these things. So that it maybe was a means to an end. Who knows? we don't know, because someone might still go, hey, you know what, it all worked, right? The trick worked. Maybe, they got what they wanted, which was, larger piece of the pie in whatever form or shape, or other concessions, which were maybe made again behind closed doors, which, you haven't heard of yet. So who knows? But, you can see why the clubs are doing it and why, like you said, this will come back again, whether it takes 5 years or shorter or longer, who knows? But, that debate will continue. I'm sure they'll learn a few things from this if they ever come back in what fashion it maybe is, or who knows? UEFA's Champions League, which for all intents and purposes is an amazing league, generates billions of dollars for the sport. So it's not about this. The league is poorly run, right? It's a very successful league, and I had people on the podcast who've been part of this and helped build it, and by all again, we're talking billions and billions of dollars being generated. One of the biggest IP in the world. Can you still make it better? Sure, right? But it's almost like saying, let's dismantle the NBA because, there are too many clubs now, and let's shrink it down and really only focus on the big teams. That's literally what they're almost trying to do here, right? So I think it was a bit crazy from the start, and I'm sure we'll continue watching a bit more about it. So I don't know if you have any last thought on it, and then we'll move on to some other more fun topics here.
Just the only two thoughts are one is never underestimate the value of good operators. Right? That at the end of the day, the sports organizations over the last 15 years that have created the most value competitively and financially have been the ones that are the best operators. And in a lot of ways, and that's going to continue. And then the second thing is the underlying issues haven't changed. So I think there needs to be, some way to address them. I'm not necessarily advocating for, a Super League 2 by any means. I'm just saying that just because this failed spectacularly doesn't mean that the underlying metrics were cured by the fan revolt to push back against it.
Yeah, exactly. And we next time when we get Michael in here as well, since he worked with FIFA, what FIFA is doing there was their extended World Cup now with 48 teams. I think there is a point in time it's too much, where you do want the real quality rather than just adding, and FIFA is a bad example of that in my view. But anyway, we don't want to go there now because I want to come back to, really, what you were doing here, I would say the last few years since, you left Rome. You started your own business again, I believe, Union Sports, if I see this correctly, right?
Yes.
Private consulting group there. So I want to hear a bit about what you're doing there, and of course, your current company, Inner Market Media. How these pieces are all connected, and then we'll wrap it up with a little bit of Vancouver Whitecap story here. So talk us through the rest here.
So Union Sports was a shop we set up, consultancy to help people rationalize typically sports property, people who have some equity stake in sports properties. And that doesn't necessarily just mean clubs or teams or tours. It could be media companies, technology companies, people who own stadia, whatever. They tend to have holdings in a bunch of different entities. Some they control outright, some they may have a limited passive investment in. And it was to help them rationalize that and pull together, all these assets into tight organizing businesses and tightly organized businesses. And so we did that for about 4 years. Yeah.
So give me a couple of examples of who do you guys work with, if you can mention them.
We try never to talk about individual clients. I just think that these are all privately held concerns. And I just think that what we found is our ability to operate effectively for people. Discretion is a big part of it. And,
okay.
And so, we're known for that. And so that's something that we employed when I was at Union, and then we employ here now at Inner Market, although Inner Market is a newer version. I wound down Union Sports and went up to Vancouver for the Whitecaps in January of 2020. And we had some very significant,
all hell broke loose.
Yeah, we had some very significant plans. It was a stadium. It was a massive rebuild. The club had been struggling in the prior season. That's well documented. some of the issues that it had, and ownership made a commitment to turn the club around, and that's what I do, right? Cleanups and turnarounds. So I went up there and I spent about 6 months getting the club, its relationships with its fan base and the marketplace rehabilitated, a lot of internal cleanup and so forth. But when the pandemic hit, Marcus, about 8 weeks into my tenure there, the reality was the big project that I was brought on for was not going to happen.
Right.
So
they were also looking to build a stadium, or what was you mentioned?
It was one of the things I was working on for sure. That
right.
We were looking at, and then so I did 6 months for them, and my project ended, and came back to Austin and launched Intermarket Media. Now, the term intermarket is in North American sports, you have your inner market, which is the 75 miles around your stadium, and then the outer market, which can be, up to 150 or more. And the most valuable rights are your inner market rights. And so we formed Intermarket Media, and we do two things. We do consultancy, as we did with the union, and we're doing content creation, because what I found is that if you're creating some content that focuses on the business of sport, you allow potential clients or people you'll be negotiating against to take a look at the way you operate, the approach and methodology, and we found it's been very creative.
Interesting. Yeah. So that, again, it's fairly new, and that you could argue this is really coming out of in the middle of COVID is when you started this here. So, how have you seen this affecting dealing with the industry? Because I'm assuming from the sound of it, it is very much focused on the U.S. market, right? For now, of what you're doing there.
No, in fact, actually, so I believe there's a great intersection of opportunity that sits really transatlantic, and so we really try and focus on both markets. So the content we produce, for example, we produce OTT Sports video series. You can find it on our Intermarket Media website. You can see it on YouTube and so forth. That really focuses on sports from professional sports from North America and also the UK and Europe.
All right,
and the contrast there. My co-host in that, Michael Browden, is a longtime sports industry professional, operator and investor based out of London, and so we tend to crack issues that are happening that affect either market or both markets simultaneously. So it gives us a good perspective.
Yeah, I've seen you guys. I've listened to a couple of the podcasts which you has up there. So you got the sort of short topical podcast, and then of course you guys are now on Clubhouse as well with the OTT Sports Speakeasy. I believe that's what it's called, right?
So the Speakeasy.
Let's give a quick shout out to that. When are you guys hosting that every week?
We host it on Thursdays, 5:00 in the UK, noon in the East Coast of the US, and 9 a.m. on the West Coast. And good things happen in Speakeasies. So we like the Clubhouse platform. It allows people to join us, and if you tune in, you get the opportunity to put your hand up and come right up and talk with the professionals. We typically break that show into a breaking news section. Then we do a single interview, our locked-in interview with someone, and then we'll bring other industry professionals into a roundtable with that person, and then we open it up for a full, robust conversation. And we've had some great guests in there, and we're able to talk pretty in depth on the business aspects of it. You won't hear us talking about, is such and such a player worth such and such a transfer fee, etc. That's just, you can find that anywhere.
The corporate side,
we drill in the business.
Yeah, no, I joined you guys on one a few weeks back.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't remember even what was the topic exactly. Was it NFTs maybe even, or
no? We were talking. Glad it was memorable for you, Marcus. we were talking esports.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we were talking esports. My other favorite topic, exactly. I'm doing too many of these things, and all this stuff sometimes it becomes a bit of a blur. But no, I encourage everyone there to join you guys. Now, the weird thing is, and maybe you tell me, why is Clubhouse only on an iPhone? I mean, it just cuts out, a huge chunk of the world, including myself. I had to use my son's phone to even just join you there. I mean, it just seems to be a bit of a weird strategy.
I can understand from a tech platform standpoint that, you only have to get it right one time on the iPhone platform, right? Like,
Right.
there's only one set of variables you have to sort for, so you can launch something much more predictably. So apps tend to roll out first for an iPhone, but the reality is globally, about over 80% of all the phones are Android.
Exactly, or Android. So
it is very confining. It is very confining. Although, if I was to say to a group of developers, you have native Android, which is the Google products themselves, the Pixels and so forth, and then you have anybody from Samsung on down. They all require specific modifications to their tech stack on Android, and so rollouts tend to happen on iPhone, but it does miss a huge part of the market.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm sure it will happen, and I like it. I think it's an interesting platform. Of course, others are now copying Skype, and here, and a few others are as usual, seeing what's working. And but yeah, good luck with it. Sounds like a fun place to be and hanging out there. And we had a good fun hour here as well, touching on a few things. Comparing some notes and stories here. So, Mark, I wish you a great Sunday morning there in Austin. Marcus. Stay safe, and as we say in those times here, and we'll keep watching these industries together, and I'm sure we'll be talking a few more times, maybe together there on Clubhouse.
Yeah, I hope so. Listen, I would say to your audience as a final thing, we are headed into a wild expansion period for sports. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be linear growth, with the line going from the lower left-hand part of the chart up to the top right corner, steady gains. There's going to be some dips as we go, but this is an expansionist era. We, as industry professionals, are dealing with a product that people need to tune into when it's happening, and so it is very. We talked earlier about audience erosion. It is very audience erosion proof in a lot of ways, and so I'd say to everyone out there, take heart. This is a tough period. We're gonna, there's gonna be some more punches thrown at us, I think, as we go forward. But if you look back a decade from now, I think the level of expansion you're going to see in this industry as it melds and becomes more of a media industry, is in a gaming industry, in a gambling industry, I think is just the growth is going to be breathtaking.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm sure it will, you guys are, you and Michael covering lots of those stuff, and we'll have more conversations on that. And, whether it's the spec world, which of course is again, bringing a whole new level of money now into sport again. And I'm working with a couple of people there. The NFT world is fascinating as anything with, what the NBA is doing. And of course, others around the world, and you add a bit of esports and gaming and other, the crypto world is dramatically moving in now. I've seen a couple of crypto deals again. Crypto.com just announced a deal with Aston Martin. So there is new money coming in, but it looks very different, and it definitely feels very different, right? As the pandemic isn't quite coming that to a close yet, right? I mean, Thailand is just shutting down again here. So these second, third waves in many countries are still happening. And so I think we're still in there a bit for a ride, but we're going to be hanging in there and keep adding our value to it wherever we can.
Looking forward to it, Marcus. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great honor.
Thank you, and enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.